There have been a few times when the world was seconds away from being completely destroyed, but none of which were nearly as tense as this first story. The US was preparing plans to invade Cuba, with over 130 million of today's dollars being used to explore options to invade. Though of course the US isn't going to invade with no reason. Well, actually, no, I take that back. That does sound like something they would do. But at least they had somewhat of a reason. You see, before 1959, Cuba was run by a close friend of the USA, who ensured that American companies controlled much of the economy like sugar, tobacco, and tourism. But then out of nowhere, a random dude's neurons activated and he realized that their country looked like a complete dumbass who were getting completely bullied by the US. That guy's name was Fidel Castro, and he got the world to the closest it's ever been to nuclear war. Fidel started a revolution that got him in total control of Cuba, and the US did not like that one bit. That's because Fidel began redistributing land, taking over American businesses, where he pretty much did whatever he could do to just piss off American elites. But this didn't really concern Eisenhower, who at the time was the US president. I mean, screw those guys anyway. But what really got him mad was the fact that Fidel Castro turned Cuba into a communist country, which at the time, America was no. So after a bunch of smaller missions to kill Fidel failed, the green light was given for a massive invasion. But newly elected President Kennedy wasn't to keep America's involvement a secret, because it would not be fun trying to explain to the public why you're rigging another country's politics. Wait a minute. So instead of sending US troops, they sent Cuban exiles. And it went as poorly as you could probably imagine. Once a makeshift army landed, people on the island completely dropped what they were doing and happily danced with the exiles into the government buildings, as they declared themselves overthrown. At least that's what the CIA were hoping for. But in reality, when the exiles arrived and were shouting at the people to join them in their rebellion, people were mostly confused and upset, since they didn't like how things were being run currently. And it didn't help that over 20,000 troops were waiting to murder the exiles, since the government had been tipped off about the possible invasion. The invasion flopped pretty bad, since over 100 invaders were killed and thousands more were captured, which only made Castro's position stronger, since he now claimed the US was out to get him. This led to Cuba getting pretty much closer with Russia and asking for more support, which they got in the form of a bunch of nukes that they were planning to install on the island. They did this as a way to protect the island, and also a way to counter the nukes of the US that they had placed in Italy and Turkey. And by this time, the US eventually figured out that the materials for the nukes were already in place. So they had to act fast to prevent nukes from getting into the island, which is when things got a whole lot more serious. But while the American government was debating on what to do, the Russians were busy setting up their own nukes. They only worked at night and put camouflage on the nukes during the day so they wouldn't be spotted. And in just over a week, the nukes would be active. It would be the biggest strategic victory in Russian history. And the US now had to act even faster, because if the Russians finished setting up, things would get a lot more serious. Several ideas came out at meetings, but the two main ideas stuck with the team. The first idea came from a very high military commander, Curtis LeMay. And just to give you an idea of who this guy really is, this is the same guy that helped drop the nukes in Japan. So make of that as you will. His idea is to have an air fleet bomb every single launch site in Cuba and launch a full-scale invasion at the same time. This would cost the lives of a lot of people, but with just few days to prep, it could mean that the conflict would be over in less than a week. A lot of the military advisors actually agreed with this idea, but all the non-military people were absolutely horrified by the idea, including President Kennedy. So they brought up a second plan. They wanted to put the US Navy all around Cuba to intercept any shipments going into Cuba, in hopes of catching these nukes. And while it might have sounded better on paper, it turned out a whole lot worse when they probably thought it would have. You see, on October 22nd, Kennedy announced that the US Navy would intercept all shipments coming to Cuba. But there was one slight problem with that, which is the naval blockade is considered an act of war, even though Kennedy claimed it was just a quarantine measure. The Russians still didn't appreciate this either, as one of the highest commanders in the Soviet Union wrote this letter to Kennedy stating, "The violation of freedom to use international waters and international airspace is an act of aggression, which pushes mankind toward the abyss of world nuclear war." Pretty poetic for a guy who barely speaks English, huh? Also, why did I sound Italian? I just realized that. And this letter started the most heated and tense 6-day battle in all of human history. The US pushed very hard to get Cuba and the Soviet Union to remove the missiles, but the communists claimed that they were only defensive. After this, the US put its nuclear force on what was called DEFCON 2, which is the closest the US ever got to launching nukes, as it's the only time DEFCON DEFCON 2 has ever been used at all. One step closer, we would have been playing Fallout IRL, since DEFCON 1 means the apocalypse is actually happening. Just to point out how insane that is, after the Ukraine war broke out, the US went up to DEFCON 3, which has only happened 3 times after 1970. But even though tensions were at a literal all-time high, Russian ships knew about the blockade and departed from the Soviet Union to Cuba, ready for war. The US gave radio warnings to turn back, and if any ship refuses these warnings, a single warning shot would be fired at them. If they refuse to turn back, US ships are authorized to absolutely annihilate any ship with gunfire, sinking them. Still, a few hundred miles out, the Soviets seemed to not care about any of these warnings as they kept cruising towards Cuba. This kept going for a few days as the ships were getting closer and closer until they were approached to the quarantine zone. They refused all orders to turn back so far, and the US were getting their battle stations ready to engage in combat. But at the last minute, the ships just turned around. Well, almost all of them did. A single oil tanker refused to turn around and was slowly but surely approaching the quarantine zone. They only had hours to decide what to do with the ships. Officers were then ordered to not shoot at the ships without direct orders from President Kennedy, as sinking it would begin the biggest war in human history. Kennedy himself was informed on the ship, and his advisors explained that they had to let the ship go through. It might encourage more ships to do so, the same as the US looked weak, but if they shot it down, it would mean the end of the world. They were quickly running out of time to decide, and when Kennedy finally ordered the troops to let the ships dock in Cuba, this is only the first close call they actually had. However, the following day, Fidel sends the Russian government a letter telling them to launch nuclear missiles at the US. This guy was willing to sacrifice his land, his people, basically the rest of the world if it meant the US would burn with them. The Russians didn't really get much time to think about it though, as it might have been the stupidest thing they've read in a very long time. Like seriously, this guy was just insane. But the letter did give the Russian leader the idea to write one of his own to Kennedy. So he quickly wrote a letter explaining that he wanted to find peaceful solutions with the US so the world wouldn't reset to the Stone Age. There were a few problems with this though. Since the letter got leaked, Russian leaders Nikita Khrushchev would look weak to its citizens and allies. But if Kennedy agreed with the letter and it all turned out to be a trick, he would look pretty naive. They didn't have much time to talk about the letter though, as one of the following days, the first casualties of this conflict would happen. The US had been flying all over Cuba to keep track of nukes, but by this time it was detected by Cuban radars. In theory, they couldn't really do much though, as the missiles themselves were owned by the Soviet Union, and they were under very clear instructions not to fire anything without the approval of Kremlin. And since they obviously didn't want to start the last war to ever happen, they stood down and didn't shoot. Nah, I'm just kidding. The Russian guys later shouted at his men to take the plane down. So within minutes, a missile was launched at the U-2 spy plane. It was hit in the rear, and shrapnel from the impact killed the pilot. Before the plane even left the ground, the White House decided that if it was shot down, the two sides wouldn't even talk, and instead the military response would be immediately launched. The only issue is that the Americans didn't know what the Soviet Union had set up in their nuclear arsenal, and was ready to fire it, instantly ending all American invasion. Luckily for us, the Americans didn't actually end up doing anything like they said they would, and instead offered to have a nice chat about the situation. But while the Americans were discussing what to do, yet another incident was about to happen and start World War III. Soviet subs had been detected near the Caribbean, and now one of them was coming near the quarantine zone. The US dropped depth charges in the sub in order to warn it to come up. But the submarines saw this as an act of war, and because of how deep they were in the water, they had no way to communicate with Moscow. So a lot of the high officers on board agreed that the war had broken out and they were about to prepare to launch a nuke. To do this, however, they needed the approval of 3 senior officers on board. The first 2 agreed, so all that was standing between the end of the world was the opinion of one single man. He began to sweat and thought about it for a while, and luckily he chose not to launch the nuke. And after this incident, the 2 countries made an agreement. Russia would remove its nukes from Cuba if the US removed theirs from Turkey. The agreement was broadcast live, and after a few long intense weeks, the issue was finally resolved. But hey, if you like this video, make sure to click the video on screen. YouTube thinks you'll like it, we do too. It's a pretty good video. Right, bye bye.